One thing that I wanted to look into with my final video project was sort of a street view signage comparison between different Chinatowns across the globe. Um, as I thought this would be an interesting study to look into to sort of characterize or sort of maybe gather insights about the various populations in these places. Starting with the Boston Chinatown area, there's a lot of heavy emphasis on traditional characters and using traditional characters as a means of sort of um, claiming identity, right? For example, this gate, which is donated by Taiwan to the U.S., signifying the friendship between the two countries, has messages that represent that sentiment, and the characters themselves read from right to left, which makes sense, given it's sort of like traditional writing, Chinese, on the back for characteristics. Eventually, you can see with the shops in the area using Google Street View, yeah, sort of gain that understanding. One insight or one observation I made with some of the signage was the fact that, oh, there's a lot of shops that have this sort of like visual focus with bolder font juxtaposed to perhaps more modern or more print friendly looking font, I suppose. Right? We can see this multiple places in Boston Chinatown as well. Um, for example, here, and I think another interesting thing to look at and to think about is how different groups of Chinese people, different ethnic groups and associations may use and write Chinese characters in specific ways, maybe as a way of identifying themselves or sort of like building community or claiming something as their own. Um, I think another interesting feature of Boston Chinatown is the fact that a lot of the streets do have Chinese names, though in comparison to English names, it is kind of needed in a sense. And the juxtaposition and the placement of English versus Chinese characters in the Boston Chinatown area, I think it's hard for me to generalize, but a lot of shops generally use the uh, Chinese as the forefront more often. This shop, I would say, probably used the English one more. For example, the supermarket, the Chinese characters are big, bold font. And then one other interesting thing I found was this inscription on the side of the building. It was kind of cool to look at. The second Chinatown that I looked into was the Singapore Chinatown, which I think had a wide range of interesting characteristics. For example, there's a sort of like clerical seal script or a clerical script juxtaposed to more modern sort of printed font. Yeah, I thought it was cool with that. I think there's also something to be said about the fact that maybe traditional characters sometimes here may sort of be associated with like a long history of something. For example, this shop having a long history of noodle making. As discussed in a paper that I read about Singapore Chinatown signage, um, there's a lot of interesting things to consider. For example, Singaporean Chinese people tend to use traditional characters at a higher rate than Chinese immigrants, um, and also are more inclined typically to use multilingual signs. Um, and you can see this with this particular sign, which is kind of interesting. It uses sort of a half and half message with half the message in Chinese and half of it in English. The full thing put together is the fact that it's a male monsieur for men, um, but you only get half and half with Chinese version and English together. Um, and also, I think in Singapore, it appears from a Google Street View overview that there are a lot of places with, more big, bold characters. Oh, because there's a higher proportion of Chinese people in the area. The next Chinatown that I looked at was the New York Chinatown, which I think uses approaches calligraphy and Chinese calligraphy in a more like artsy sort of way, which I mean, we've seen in class before. But here the visual focus is not with the Chinese character itself, but with the techniques and the other visual effects that it has for people. And then we can see, you know, see with this eye shop, the fact that, oh, the eyeglasses are situated between these three figures and kind of gives the shop a little bit more flavor, a little bit more character, liveliness, right? Same with this shop as well, right? And I think this is to say that I think um, different stages of like the history within the Chinatown can sort of be captured in how the signs are represented as well, and how Chinese characters and the calligraphic techniques are used um, visually. For example, if you look at older shops, so for example, this printing shop or this lumber shop in New York Chinatown, only a few neighborhoods away, it's more traditional. It's more of what you would expect to see according to the rules or standards that we have, right? But, you know, these things evolve, these things change, and it represents a sort of not changing with the times, but there are different time spans for Chinese calligraphy, right? And I think there's also an interesting thing to consider when it comes to different populations of Chinese people. For example, Fujianese people, using perhaps simplified characters versus traditional characters or something like that, right? So there's different enclaves or neighborhoods that have different calligraphic um, characteristics compared to other enclaves, or certain buildings and certain organizations using specific font for whatever purpose. The last place that I want to take a look at and to talk about is actually Vancouver. Shoot, the Vancouver Chinatown. I think this is the coolest thing because the coolest one out of them because there's something that's really unique, which is the neon light scene in Vancouver, and the way this is interfaced with Chinese calligraphy and Chinese calligraphy art is the fact that, oh, the neon lights, like the backbone of them represents sort of the strokes, and then the overall lighting effect can be captured with this sort of like mm, thicker, these thicker lines that I try to sort of capture within my practice. And there's actually a long history here with this that I can't get into, but it is very interesting. And we can see that a lot of the rest of Vancouver Chinatown has very similar characteristics in terms of a lot of shops use traditional characters, I think. And I think there's maybe less shops that I looked into here, but the neon light thing is a pretty cool thing. For example, this gate feature is very similar to the Boston Chinatown. But also to say is it's very interesting looking into this sort of thing when it comes to how Chinese calligraphy and how Chinese characters interact and look within like, the daily lives of people, Chinese people across the globe, how that has interfaced with, for example, the diaspora movement of people, ideas over time. It's very cool.